Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Let's just jump straight into it. Today, we're dissecting the anatomy of an empire. We're going to look at how a tiny, fiercely elite cadre of British civil servants engineered an administrative system that was so robust, so deeply entrenched, that it essentially still governs the massive populations of South Asia right now, today. We're talking, of course, about the Indian Civil Service, or the ICS. Honestly, if you want to understand modern colonial governance and its long-term fallout, you absolutely have to understand the ICS.
So, here's our agenda for today. First, we'll look at forging the steel frame. Then we'll break down the ranks, pay, and power. After that, we'll cover the push for Indianization, navigate partition and the transition, and finally, wrap up with the enduring administrative legacy.
All right, Section 1. Forging the Steel Frame. Origins of the ICS.
You know, when British Prime Minister David Lloyd George called the ICS the steel frame, he wasn't just throwing around a fun metaphor. The British literally viewed this institution as the absolute structural core of their empire in India. They truly believed that if you took that specific administrative framework away, the entire fabric of British rule would just instantly collapse into total chaos. It was that critical. And to really wrap your head around the weight of that steel frame, imagine this staggering number: 300,000. At the absolute peak of the empire, a single ICS officer, they usually just called him a civilian, ruled over an average of 300,000 subjects. I mean, think about the sheer scale of that power for a second. We're talking about a tiny cadre, usually just a little over 1,000 men at any given time, overseeing the lives, the revenues, and the laws for more than 300 million people across 250 massive districts.
So how did this whole thing actually come together? Well, before 1853, the East India Company directors would kind of just handpick their favorites. But in 1853, Parliament swapped out that patronage system for highly competitive exams. They wanted the absolute brightest minds, specifically recruiting from places like Oxford and Cambridge. Then, after the massive rebellion of 1857, governance formally transferred over to the British Crown in 1858, making the ICS the official administrative arm of the state. Fast forward to the Government of India Act in 1919, and you get this major structural shift that splits the imperial services into All India and Central Services.
Moving on to Section 2. Ranks, pay, and power. The bureaucratic hierarchy.
Now, the Raj ran on this incredibly rigid bureaucratic blueprint. You had the central government tracking on one side and the provincial government on the other. But as students of history, the piece I really want you to focus on is the role of the district collector. And yes, the title collector literally comes from the fact that land revenue collection was the absolute center of the government's universe. This local officer wasn't just the tax guy, though. He was the magistrate, the chief executive, basically the absolute focal point of local state power. The entire pyramid of the state rested squarely on the shoulders of these district officers.
But as you can probably guess, power wasn't the only perk. The money was wildly skewed. Just think about this crazy financial disparity from the early 20th century. You've got roughly 8,000 European officials pulling in almost 14 million pounds in total salaries. Meanwhile, 130,000 Indians in government service collectively earned just over 3 million pounds. So a microscopic fraction of the workforce was commanding more than 4 times the wealth of the vast majority of the local employees.
And it goes beyond just the base salaries. The ICS offered Europeans this absolutely unparalleled long-term financial security. A young assistant commissioner might start at, say, £300 a year, but the top governors were pulling in a massive 6,000 plus allowances. And the ultimate prize at the end of it all? A guaranteed £1,000 annuity pension when you retired. It was so incredibly lucrative that there was actually a popular saying at the time that an ICS marriage was worth $300 a year alive or dead. Because yeah, even widows were guaranteed a £300 annuity.
Okay, Section 3, the push for Indianization, testing the steel frame.
Obviously, having a purely European ruling class governing an entire Indian population was just completely unsustainable. For decades, the ICS exams were only held in London, which was naturally a massive barrier for Indian candidates. Indian nationalists, especially the moderates, were constantly pushing for change here. In 1893, the House of Commons actually passed a resolution to allow simultaneous exams, but it was a painfully slow crawl to make that a reality. It wasn't until World War I that the British really had their hand forced. A huge drop in British recruits meant they had to start making direct appointments in 1915 just to fill the empty spots. Finally, in 1922, exams were permitted in Delhi. The British were slowly realizing there was just no way they could run the empire without genuinely bringing Indians into the upper echelons. All of this pressure eventually culminated in the 1924 Lee Commission. This is a super important moment. The British were essentially trying to juggle these nationalist demands while still keeping their own hands firmly on the wheel. So they recommended that future ICS batches be strictly divided, 40% Europeans, 40% Indians, and 20% directly promoted from the lower provincial civil services. It was definitely an attempt to balance the scales, but as the independence movement really kicked into high gear in the 30s and 40s, it just became impossible to maintain British recruitment, and that balance irrevocably shifted.
Which brings us right to Section 4, Partition and the Transition, recasting the frame. Right at the moment of independence in 1947, if you take a demographic snapshot of the ICS, you see an incredibly precarious situation. Out of 980 total officers, the largest single block, 468 of them, were Europeans, and almost all of them left. The remaining Indian officers, who are mostly Hindus and Muslims, were suddenly split between the newly partitioned nations of India and Pakistan. This extremely sudden departure of nearly half of the senior administrative brain trust created this massive, terrifying vacuum for two brand new states that were already struggling with the sheer chaos of partition.
But here's the fascinating part. They didn't scrap the system. Continuity is the key word here. Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, had actually made fun of the ICS in the past, joking that it was neither Indian, nor civil, nor service. But when independence actually hit, he and Sardar Patel kept it. They just rebranded it. In India, it became the Indian Administrative Service, or IAS. Over in Pakistan, it became the Civil Service of Pakistan, or CSP. They kept the exact same core duties: governance, law and order, and revenue collection. The steel frame quite literally outlived the empire that built it.
Now, there are some really interesting historical anomalies in this transition, too. Like we said, almost all the British officers went back to the UK, but a handful actually stayed on, mostly on the judicial side. The wildest example of this is Justice William Broome. He married an Indian woman back in the 1930s, and he actually completely renounced his British citizenship in 1958, and he had the direct support of Prime Minister Nehru to do it. Broome served on the Allahabad High Court all the way until 1972. He was literally the last former ICS officer of European origin serving in independent India. Just incredible. All right, our final part, Section 5, the enduring administrative legacy, colonial roots today. So why does all this specific colonial history actually matter to the people living in South Asia right now? Well, if you dive into the academic perspectives on the transition from colonial law to constitutional law, you'll see this really complex synthesis. India's legal system didn't just magically appear out of thin air. Scholars point out this ongoing, really fascinating tension. After 1947, India built a modern democratic constitutional order, but they built it directly on top of the imported British legal architecture. They didn't revert to pre-colonial systems. Instead, they adapted that existing colonial machinery to serve a brand new democratic republic.
And these colonial inheritances, they aren't just superficial leftovers. They are literally the undisputed structural backbone of Indian jurisprudence today. I mean, we're talking about the Indian Penal Code, which was originally drafted by Thomas Macaulay way back in the 1830s. We're talking about the Evidence Act, the fundamental architecture of contracts and property law, the entire adversarial trial system, the whole hierarchical structure of the courts. Every single bit of that comes directly from the British tradition and the groundwork laid by the ICS.
So as students of history, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. When we look at modern South Asian governance, the districts, the collectors, the penal codes, all these administrative hierarchies, are we looking at a relic of the 19th century colonial past? Or are we looking at the permanent, inescapable foundation of the present? It's this continuous, living synthesis of British form that's been filled with local substance. Keep that in mind the next time you look at the real, day-to-day mechanics of state power. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history around you.